The Instruction of Amenemope, a father's lament over and remonstrance with a son who has abandoned the scribble life to become a sailor and adventurer in foreign lands. It is known from a single ostracon dating from the 20th dynasty. Amenemope is an actual historical figure known to us from a number of ostraca and graffiti found at the Theban workmen's community of Deir el-Medina, where he served as a draftsman in the royal tombs. He is mentioned as the purchaser of a donkey in a text dated in the 28th year of Ramses III, which makes him roughly contemporaneous with Amenemope. Amenemope's lament seems to have been justified, since his ne'er-do-well son is accused in the same sources of various forms of misconduct, including shady financial dealings and sexual improprieties with another workman's wife. Amenemope falls somewhere between the categories of instructions and discourses, the hymns and prayers to Thoth. We have already seen with the hymn to Hapi that a hymn to a deity could properly have a place among Egypt's Mot literature. Since Thoth was the patron deity of the professional scribes who comprised the bulk of Egypt's literate class, one might expect that Mot literature should include hymns about, prayers to, and praises of that god. And indeed, this is precisely what we do find, especially in the Ramesside era. Such texts are known from Papyrus Anastasi III, Papyrus Anastasi Phi, Papyrus Salier I, and Papyrus Salier C, among others. A comparison between these texts, especially the hymn in Papyrus Salier and the Instruction of Amenemope, shows that Amenemope himself was deeply influenced by the ideas and attitudes expressed in these works. E0.211. Obviously, these works belong to the category of hymns and prayers. We have now arrived at our final list of the Mot literature, which constitutes the intertextual environment within which the Instruction of Amenemope must be understood. In the order in which they were introduced above, these works are: Instruction for Kejemni, Instruction of Harjedef, Instruction of Ptah-hotep, Admonitions of Ipawer, Words of Kakhet-Sinib, Lowliest Instruction, Prophecy of Nefertiti, Instruction for Merikere, Instruction of Amenemhat, Satire of the Trades, Hymn to Hapi, Stela of Mentuhotep, Instruction of a Man for his Son, Dispute of a Man with his Bay, Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, Songs of the Harpers, Instruction of Ani, Instruction of Amenakne, Instruction of Mena, Hymns and Prayers to Thoth. All of these works were composed either prior to the Instruction of Amenemope or roughly contemporaneously with it. All of them either helped to define the context in which Amenemope was written or else reflected that context in their own composition. And virtually all of them are works with which Amenemope himself could have been familiar. Indeed, we know he was familiar with some of them because he paraphrased or quoted from them. Of course, any such listing is inevitably far from complete, and the one given above is meant to be practical, not exhaustive. A more complete inventory of Mot literature might also include the many instructions which survive only in fragments, such as the Instruction of Sisebek and the Instruction of Hori, the numerous scribble compilations or miscellanies, which often incorporate selections of didactic material, the Pasupatum, usually brief, instructions, which were sometimes incorporated in mortuary autobiographies, ranging from Mechechi in the Old Kingdom to Petasiris, high priest of Thoth at Hermopolis, in the late period. The instructions, which were composed significantly later than Amenemope, such as the Brooklyn Wisdom Papyrus, a late-period composition in hieratic, and the late-period demotic instructions of Ankshashonki and Papyrus Singer, the mythological stories with Mot themes, such as the tale of truth and falsehood and the contendings of Horus and Set, prose, poetry, and metrical analysis. Fairly soon after ancient Egyptian was deciphered, in the first half of the 19th century, it was recognized that some of the surviving texts were literary compositions, and that some of these compositions were in verse. Since then, it has become generally accepted that the basic formal principle in Egyptian literary compositions is semantic recurrence. Beyond this fairly simple recognition, however, there has swirled a storm of controversy which continues to this day. The earliest sustained effort at recovering the structure of ancient Egyptian poetry was made by Adolf Erman at the end of the 19th century. As Erman later wrote, All that the Egyptian writes in elevated language falls into short lines of approximately equal length, and although we know nothing about their sound, we are nonetheless inclined to regard these lines as verse, i.e., to ascribe to them some sort of metrical structure. This is, in many cases, undoubtedly correct, positively certain in those where invariably, as the meaning shows, a fixed number of lines, generally there are 3 or 4, belong together. Ehrman identified a number of the principles of poetic construction which are recognized by Egyptologists today, including the use of parallelismus memborum. He himself described this as the feature which lends all this poetry and semi-poetry its special character, the extraordinary custom which we are wont to call parallelism of the members. It is not enough to express an idea once, it must be done twice, so that 2 short sentences of the same or similar purport always follow one another. Thus, for example, the judge awakeneth, Thoth lifteth himself up, or then spake these friends of the king, and they made answer before their God. While Ehrman correctly recognized this kind of poetic parallelism as an essential element of the Egyptian approach to dignified speech, he himself had little sympathy for it. He considered the second half of a parallel expression to be quite superfluous and the overall results absurd, and he thought the only reason that it does not surprise us as much as it should is because such parallelism is also found in the Hebrew Bible, which has accustomed us to this strange mode of expression. In fact, Ehrman went so far as to allege that Egyptian poetry possesses on the whole no meaning, a judgment which subsequent generations of Egyptologists have found less than persuasive. A bigger problem than Ehrman's questionable aesthetic judgment was the fact that he and those who followed him based their work on bits of ancient poetry which had survived among the Copts. Since the Coptic language was derived from ancient Egyptian, they reasoned, Coptic poetry should still reflect the structural principles of its ancient predecessors. Unfortunately, little progress had yet been made in recovering the phonetic structure of ancient Egyptian, so it was impossible for Ehrman and his associates to know how much the pronunciation had changed between classical Egyptian and Coptic, how heavily Coptic poetry had been influenced by Greek and Syriac, and how inaccurate were the Coptic texts upon which they were relying. The results, not surprisingly, were less than satisfactory. As Ehrman himself put it, "We are here still groping almost entirely in the dark, and shall probably always be doing so, since the question, upon which everything depends, what meter did the Egyptian verses have, remains an unanswered one for us." In the 1950s, a new approach to the problem was undertaken by Gerhard Fecht. Fecht claimed that meter was fundamental not only to obviously poetic Egyptian texts, but to any Egyptian text which made use of elevated language. Further, he claimed that the principles which determined this meter were the same regardless of genre and could be precisely formulated in a set of rules applicable to all Egyptian texts with any claim to structure. Fecht began by declaring that in non-tonal languages, there are only 3 metrical possibilities: quantity meter, based on the kind of short/long vowel distinction employed in classical Greek and Latin, syllable counting meter, such as that employed in Japanese poetry, and stress meter, which is the metrical structure used in most modern European languages. That the ancient Egyptian language also used stress meter was considered by Fecht to be absolutely certain. But whereas previous analyses, inspired by Coptic phonology, had focused on word stress, the centerpiece of Fecht's system is the idea of sentence stress. That is, the crucial element in the metrical pattern is not where the stress falls in each individual word, but where it falls in the larger semantic structures, or cola, of which the sentence is composed. For example, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Here, each line is composed of either 2 or 3 distinct cola or semantic units, and each colon has a single primary stress, although there may be 1 or more additional secondary stresses within a colon. Further, the primary stress within each colon always falls on the accented syllable of the most important word within the colon. According to Fecht, the division of a sentence into cola is a natural and even instinctive process for the native speaker of a language, and therefore its recognition or use does not require any special training. In essence, each separate colon constitutes a sense unit. whose boundaries are defined by the semantically significant pauses of the natural language, i.e., the places where the speaker might pause for breath without confusing the listener. One can observe the cogency of this approach by introducing such pauses into the nursery rhyme quoted above. First, at appropriate places. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white, pause of snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. And then at inappropriate ones, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went. The pause, lamb was pause sure to pause, go, huh. The first might be faulted as stilted or pretentious, but the sense of the rhyme remains intact. The second, however, not only sounds ridiculous, but is also very nearly unintelligible. In Fecht's schematization, each poetic line is composed of either 2 or 3 cola, seldom 1, and never 4, each of which constitutes a sense unit, or unit of meaning. The line itself comprises a larger sense unit, which is generally, but not always, a complete clause, either main or subordinate. These lines are then grouped together into larger units of either 2 or 3. The larger units are assembled into still larger ones, and so on, in a hierarchical organization whose top level is the literary work as a whole. At each stage of this process, however, the correspondence between the sense units and the poetic structure must be maintained, as Fecht himself put it. What is important is that each of these sense units, which are in fact relative sense units, is separated from the context at the beginning and the end by a caesura. The caesura, or sense division, at the beginning and end of a line must be stronger than the caesuras within the sense unit. This must be stated emphatically. The correspondence between the formal structure and the structure of the statements or sense units of the text is obligatory and valid at every level. Fecht's methodology has been widely praised and adopted. Grumach's dissertation on Amenemope, for example, includes a metrical analysis of the entire text based on Fecht's approach. But there are also those who strongly disagree with some elements of Fecht's methodology, as well as the resulting conclusions. Foremost among the critics are Miriam Lidgheim and John L. Foster. Lidgheim published a strong critique of Fecht's work less than a decade after it appeared. Among other things, she pointed out that in order to shoehorn some text into his no more than 3 stresses per line rule, it was necessary to split what were apparently 4 stress lines into 2 parts, neither of which constituted a proper sense unit. Worse, there are instances in which Fichte's analysis runs roughshod over obvious larger-scale structures, such as pairs of lines in semantic or syntactic parallelism, and it blurs the legitimate distinctions between poetry and prose. Most of all, Lidgheim objected to Fecht's claim that all structured Egyptian writing was subject to such strict metrical rules. As she pointed out, in order to make apparent prose passages fit Fecht's rule set, it is necessary either to divide some sentences arbitrarily into lines of approximately equal length, regardless of sense or syntax, or else to resort to enjambment, i.e., allowing a sense unit or grammatical structure to straddle 2 lines. While enjambment was widely practiced in Greco-Roman poetry, it was completely unknown to the Egyptians and could not have been a part of their metrical system. Lidgheim, of course, has her own views on the nature of ancient Egypt's elevated language. She divides all Egyptian literature into 3 styles. Prose, which is characterized by variously structured sentences which, because they are deliberately varied, prevent the emergence of a regular sentence rhythm and of a predictable form. Orational style, which is characterized by symmetrical constructions of the sort often found in the instructions and autobiographies. Poetry, which is sometimes indistinguishable from the orational style in terms of formal structure, but differs in terms of content and mood, of feelings conveyed and feelings aroused in the reader or listener. Unfortunately, Lidgheim's criterion for distinguishing between her second and third categories ultimately amounts, as she herself admits, to little more than, "I know it when I see it." From a structural as opposed to aesthetic standpoint, her 3 categories therefore really collapse down into 2. The fundamental difference between Fecht and Lidgheim seems to be one of overall focus. Fecht's approach starts at the bottom, with the smallest units of meaning. words organized into cola, and proceeds by building these units into ever larger units of meaning until the entire work is encompassed. Lichheim's approach starts at the top, with the largest unit of meaning, the work as a whole, and proceeds by cutting it apart into smaller and smaller units until reaching the smallest units of meaning at the bottom. Most important in Lichheim's analysis of poetic texts is the identification of the metrical line. The indicators she uses include parallelism, both semantic and syntactic, and strophic structuring, in which the organization of the poem is marked by the repetition of opening words or even entire lines. For example, consider the following text from The Dispute of a Man with His Ba. To whom shall I speak today? Brothers are mean, the friends of today do not love. To whom shall I speak today? Hearts are greedy, everyone robs his comrade's goods. To whom shall I speak today? Kindness has perished, indolence assaults everyone. To whom shall I speak today? One is content with evil, goodness is cast to the ground everywhere. It is easy to identify the strophic structure of this passage by 1. The repetition of the refrain, to whom shall I speak today? And 2. The parallel structure of each sentence following the refrain, wherein the same idea is expressed twice, but in different words. Such an analysis yields the following structure. To whom shall I speak today? Brothers are mean, the friends of today do not love. To whom shall I speak today? Hearts are greedy, everyone robs his comrade's goods. To whom shall I speak today? Kindness has perished, indolence assaults everyone. To whom shall I speak today? One is content with evil, goodness is cast to the ground everywhere. Yet another approach is that of John L. Foster. Foster rejects out of hand Lichtheim's postulation of orational style as an intermediate position between prose and poetry. He says simply, I believe Lichtheim is wrong, that there is no intermediate style. In fact, for the most part, he rejects her distinction between prose and poetry as well. Like Fichte, Foster maintains that Egyptian narrative tales are not prose at all, but a kind of narrative verse, which he distinguishes from the lyric verse of the hymns and the didactic verse of the instructions. Unlike Fichte, however, Foster does not use an extensive rule set to build up lines of verse from individual cola. Instead, he begins with the verse points which we have already mentioned earlier in this chapter, the usually read dots or strokes, which are marked above the line in many Egyptian literary texts. Foster complains that Egyptologists have tended to downplay verse points as mere dictation marks, or even to dismiss them altogether, when in fact they often represent our best evidence of the structure of Egyptian verse as perceived by the Egyptians themselves. If one takes the verse points seriously, he says, it becomes clear that they consistently mark off identifiable syntactic units. As Foster himself puts it, perhaps a bit too strongly, the verse points coincide absolutely with grammatical clauses. Once it is established that verse points mark off actual lines of verse, and that these lines have a one-to-one correspondence with clause structure, it becomes relatively easy to establish the verse lines for any text which is actually written in verse. As the next higher unit of structure, Foster proposes what he calls the thought couplet. The ancient Egyptian thought couplet is a pair of verse lines which form an independent unit of thought, syntax, and rhetoric. Rhythmically, the lines are composed of cadences, rather than the feet of a strict meter, of irregular length, and there is a pause at the end of each, the end stopped line, a pause especially prominent at the end of each second line. These lines can be built into larger units, but always as multiples of 2. There are no run-on lines, where the grammatical or rhetorical or thought content continues without break into the next couplet. One could say that the weight of the pause after the second line of any couplet is the equivalent of at least a semicolon, and often of a period. There is often a marked medial pause, a caesura, within the single line. Further, there is a pronounced sensitivity to matters of likeness and difference among units of vocabulary, syntax, and thought, so that the couplet displays a definite patterning or symmetry whether through similarity or contrast of the units. Thus, individual words, grammatical structures, and ideas display themselves balanced one against the other, or in parallel or antithetically, or in series or with incremental variation, and these patternings can occur either within halves of the single line or between the two halves of the couplet. Finally, the lines of the couplet rhyme find their unity not in a mere coincidence of final sounds, end rhyme, but in terms of the idea expressed or the grammatical formulas used. According to Foster, every line of verse must exhibit one of the following 4 grammatical constructions: a narrative verb form, ZDMF, ZDMNW, ZDMTMF, or a pseudo-verbal construction, with the caveat that the ZDMNTM form is almost entirely lacking in lyric and instructional texts; a participial or infinitive construction, with the former usually being augmented by nonverbal clause construction, implying the verb is thus, a sentence with an equation of some sort; construction beginning with a verbal preposition, are, are, etc., used as a conjunction or an indicator of equivalence. Foster also emphasizes the use of other literary devices, careful word choice, puns, simile and metaphor, alliteration, and so forth. Fecht has vehemently criticized Foster for relying so heavily on verse points, which Fecht calls a broken reed, for tendentious selection of examples, for drawing supporting evidence from such difficult texts as the Hymn to Hapi and the Instruction of Ptahhotep, and for his reluctance to recognize the existence of triplets as well as couplets. But of course, Lichheim has offered similarly pointed criticisms of Fecht for his own apparent shortcomings, and Foster has criticized Lichheim's formulations as well, thereby completing the circle. It is hard to avoid the impression that much of the controversy is a mere quibbling over words. At best, one is reminded of the story of the blind man and the elephant. Fortunately, it is not necessary for us to resolve the competing charges and counterclaims on this issue. As readers attempting to wrest some kind of meaning out of an admittedly difficult text, and therefore more interested in productive heuristics than in ironclad theoretical rigor, we can shamelessly appropriate whatever methods seem to work best. Where the systems of Fecht, Lichtheim, and Foster overlap, and the areas of overlap are substantial, we may consider the results to be assured. Where they do not overlap, we may simply apply whichever system seems most advantageous in making sense of the text at hand. In his recent book on Egyptian poetry, K.A. Kitchen has provided an inventory of the stylistic techniques used in Egyptian literature as a whole. Since most or all of these are unobjectionable regardless of the theory one uses to analyze and explain them, it will be useful to summarize the most important of them, with minor modifications, for future reference. The basic unit of Egyptian verse is the line, which generally but not always consists of a single complete clause, main or subordinate. The basic principle of poetic style is parallelism, semantic and/or syntactic. Common forms of parallelism include 1. Synonymous parallelism, in which the second half simply repeats the ideas of the first half in different words. 2. Synthetic parallelism, in which the two halves share the same basic theme, but the second half augments or extends the statement of the first. 3. Antithetic parallelism, in which the second half expresses a contrast with the first half. Parallelism can occur within a line, when two half-lines correspond to each other in structure or meaning, or between lines, when two or more lines correspond to each other in structure or meaning. Parallelism most commonly occurs in the couplet, wherein two adjacent lines stand parallel to one another, either as two independent clauses or as a main clause and a subordinate clause. Parallelism can also be found in the triplet, wherein three adjacent lines stand together to express a single thought. This can take 3 forms. 1. 3 lines all in parallel with one another, AAA. 2. A couplet followed by a trailing third line, AAB. Or 3. A single opening line followed by a couplet, AAB. Parallelism can also be found in the quatrain, wherein 4 adjacent lines stand together to express a single thought. Common patterns include couplet plus couplet, AABB, line couplet line, AABB or ABBB, and triplet plus line, AABB. There are also interleaved couplets, AABC, in which A and B stand in one sort of parallelism to each other while A also parallels C and B parallels D. For example, A and B may exhibit synonymous parallel. Other poetic structures include chiasmus, wherein the two parts of one unit exchange places in a second unit, AB/BA, and the pivot pattern, in which one component is held in common by the units on either side, i.e. a ba, written ABA. We are especially fortunate that the scribe who copied our primary witness to the text of Amenemope, British Museum Papyrus 10,474, has already done the heaviest lifting for us. The large-scale structure is manifested by explicit chapter headings and explicit versification, i.e. the practice of writing each verse line on a separate line of the manuscript. This makes it immensely easier to identify instances of parallelism and other poetic features which the author may have employed. With that in mind, it is time for us to take a look not only at papyrus, but also at the other witnesses to the text of the Instruction of Amenemope, which have been uncovered over the past 2 centuries. An analysis of these can tell us a great deal about Amenemope, including, most notably, the approximate date of its original composition.
Chapter 3, Chronological Context, Witnesses, Dating, and Authorship.
The man who takes up the study of Semitic languages with the idea of making a living by them in England is a fool. William Wright, Professor of Arabic, Cambridge, 1877.
E.A. Wallace Budge.
The Instruction of Amenemope is known to us mainly from a single manuscript, Papyrus 10,474, which was acquired for the British Museum in 1888 by E.A. Wallace Budge, one of the most famous Orientalists of his day, and also one of the most controversial. Budge was born in 1857 to a British family with a history of foreign service in India and the Persian Gulf region. Consequently, he was surrounded from infancy by exotic artifacts and arcane text, which left him with that love for the East and for the things of the East, which was to motivate him for the rest of his life. At the age of 8, he was sent off to a boarding school where instruction began at 6 in the morning, winter and summer, and the masters spared neither themselves nor us. There, in addition to his regular studies, he was encouraged to read freely in the headmaster's personal library, which included a great many books on Semitic languages. And when, as a result, he showed an interest in reading the Hebrew Bible in the original tongue, it was arranged for him to be privately tutored by Charles Seeger, a well-known translator and instructor in Semitic languages. This was the start of a friendship which was to last until Seeger's death a decade later, and the beginning of a thorough mentoring that would set the young scholar firmly on the path toward his life's work. As soon as Budge had achieved a modicum of competency in Hebrew, Seeger added Syriac, and then, when Budge was still only 14, Assyrian cuneiform. Budge's virtuosity with the latter soon led Seeger to introduce him to Samuel Birch, the keeper of Oriental antiquities at the British Museum. Through him, Budge made the acquaintance of George Smith, the famous translator of the Chaldean account of the Deluge, as the Epic of Atrahasis was then known, and many others in the close-knit British Orientalist community. Under their tutelage, Budge was soon devouring the libraries of the Oriental Antiquities Department and the Royal Society of Literature, attending professional conferences, and transcribing cuneiform texts directly from the clay tablets in the museum's collection. By 1877, at the age of 20, he was already being commissioned, largely as a result of Birch's sponsorship, to write short articles and notes on books and antiquarian matters. The next year saw his first 2 scholarly publications, both of them under the auspices of the London Commission Society, and the other on an inscription of Sennacherib. By now it was apparent that Budge was no ordinary student, and his friends and benefactors began debating what should be done with him. In the end, it was decided that he should study Semitic languages at Cambridge, and so he did that very year, cementing his grasp of Hebrew, Syriac, and Assyrian, and winning several academic prizes along the way. He received his degree in Semitics in 1882, then stayed on under scholarship for another year to study Arabic and Ethiopic under William Wright, the eminent Cambridge Semitist. Of this final year at Cambridge, Budge later wrote that no one could wish or hope for a pleasanter life, despite his frequent clashes with Wright over the wisdom of continuing his work in Assyrian. Finally, in April of 1883, at the age of 25, Budge took employment with the British Museum as an assistant in the Department of Oriental Antiquities. When Budge first hired on with the museum, the Department of Oriental Antiquities was still presided over by his old friend and mentor Samuel Birch. Unfortunately, the now elderly Birch was severely burdened with the task of moving the department's collections into a larger space and most other work had to wait until the reorganization was completed. As it turned out, Budge's studies in Semitic languages had prepared him for everything but the one task which Birch actually assigned to him: tending the department's Egyptian section. Budge was somewhat taken aback by the assignment at first, since it made no use whatever of his arduous years of university preparation. Nevertheless, he applied himself to the task with his usual diligence, immersing himself in the language and culture of yet another ancient civilization. And less than 2 years later, he had advanced sufficiently to publish his first work in Egyptology, the sarcophagus of Ankh-Nask. Birch died unexpectedly in December of 1885. Early the next year, the trustees of the museum approved a new name for the department, which now became the Department of Egyptian and Assyrian Antiquities, and a new keeper for those antiquities, Peter Lepage Renouve. There was also a new assignment for Budge. He was to accompany a British expedition on a 4-month tour of Egypt, November 1886 to February 1887, where he would assist in the excavation of ancient tombs and, quite incidentally, see about acquiring some new antiquities for the museum. The experience served Budge well, not only in introducing him to the basics of field archaeology, but also in teaching him how to deal with the army of stiff-necked imperial bureaucrats, corrupt local officials, rival archaeologists, tourists, freebooters, thieves, and other troublesome creatures who inevitably plagued any expedition to Egypt during that period, or perhaps any other. Budge returned to London heavily laden with valuable antiquities and far wiser in the ways of the world. As it turned out, this was to be the first trip of many, not only to Egypt, but also to Mesopotamia and the Sudan. Finally, in 1893, only 10 years after he was hired on as an assistant, Budge became the official keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities, a post he was to retain for the next 3 decades.
Papyrus 10,474, the discovery of Amenemope.
It was on Budge's second expedition for the museum, December 1887 to April 1888, that he acquired the Instruction of Amenemope. Ironically, the original destination for the journey was not Egypt at all, but Mesopotamia. The decision to detour through Egypt was made only because word had reached London of the presence at Thebes of some newly discovered and potentially valuable texts: intact papyri from a Theban tomb and cuneiform tablets from Amarna. The prospect of obtaining a number of significant Egyptian texts, especially the undreamed-of possibility of discovering cuneiform tablets so far removed from Mesopotamia, must have excited Budge like nothing else. His lifelong fascination with obscure texts had been strongly reinforced at Cambridge by William Wright, who had never ceased to tell me that the best work I could do was to edit texts and to publish them with translations. Wright had even gone so far as to draw up a list of Syriac and Ethiopic texts which he felt Budge ought to tackle, and suggested that the publication of these, with translations into English, would form a useful occupation for me for the rest of my life. Now Budge was faced with the prospect of uncovering something far older and more significant than anything he or Wright had ever envisioned. Budge reached Alexandria on December 16th, and with a few days on his hands before he could proceed upriver, he decided to make the rounds of the local British community. Before long, he encountered the local British consul, who informed him that he had already been forewarned of Budge's mission by the British consul general in Cairo, and that he intended to oppose Budge and the British Museum by every means in his power. Other local officials were more supportive, however, and Budge seems to have proceeded on his way without undue concern. His next stop was Cairo, which was buzzing with rumors of the finds in Thebes and Amarna. Budge now realized, if he hadn't already, that he was in a multifarious competition involving the indigenous antiquities dealers, representatives of several other European museums, and most importantly, the officials of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, who wished to claim the finds for the French-run Boulak Museum, now the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. This latter effort was, oddly enough, supported by the local British officials, who informed Budge that whatever the objects might be which had been discovered, they ought to go to the Boulak Museum, and that any attempt made to obtain any part of them for the British Museum must be promptly crushed. Budge was still undeterred, however, and taking the night train from Cairo to Asyut, he boarded a steamboat and headed upriver, shadowed the whole time by Egyptian police, acting under orders from the Antiquities Service. One might have expected Budge to go immediately to Luxor, the modern name for southern Thebes, where the much-sought Alker scrolls and tablets were hidden. But this is precisely what he did not do. Instead, he took the steamer all the way to the first cataract at Aswan, 100 miles further to the south, renewing old acquaintances along the way and bargaining with the local antiquities dealers at each stop. Luxor was indeed one of those stops, but he says that the ship paused there for only a few hours, just long enough for him to inquire after the details of the recent finds and to fetch a few unwanted skulls for the cranium collection of a friend back home. It was only on the way back downstream that Budge actually debarked at Luxor and took up the business for which he had been sent to Egypt in the first place. The description in Budge's autobiography of his time in Luxor is taken up almost entirely with his acquisition of the Amarna tablets, which, against all expectation, turned out to be genuine, and the efforts which were required to keep them from being seized by the Egyptian authorities. He tells us very little about his other activities there, and nothing at all about his acquisition of the Instruction of Amenemope. But we can get some feeling for what the experience may have been like from Budge's description of his recovery of some other important papyri at Thebes on the same expedition. Soon after my return to Luxor, I set out with some natives one evening for the place on the western bank where the finds of papyri had been made. Here I found a rich store of fine and rare objects, and among them the largest roll of papyrus I had ever seen. The roll was tied round with a thick band of papyrus cord and was in a perfect state of preservation, and the clay seal which kept together the ends of the cord was unbroken. The roll lay in a rectangular niche in the north wall of the sarcophagus chamber, among a few hard stone amulets. It seemed like sacrilege to break the seal and untie the cord, but when I had copied the name on the seal, I did so, for otherwise it would have been impossible to find out the contents of the papyrus. We unrolled a few feet of the papyrus an inch or so at a time, for it was very brittle, and I was amazed at the beauty and freshness of the colors of the human figures and animals, which, in the dim light of the candles and the heated air of the tomb, seemed to be alive. A glimpse of the judgment scene showed that the roll was a large and complete codex of the Parimhu, or Book of the Dead, and scores of lines repeated the name of the man for whom this magnificent roll had been written and painted, viz., Ani, the real royal scribe, the registrary of the offerings of all the gods, overseer of the granaries of the lords of Abydos, and scribe of the offerings of the lords of Thebes. In another place, also lying in a niche in the wall, was another papyrus, Codex of the Book of the Dead, which, although lacking the beautiful vignettes of the Papyrus of Ani, was obviously much older, and presumably of greater importance philologically. The name of the scribe for whom it was written was Nu, and the names of his kinsfolk suggested that he flourished under one of the early kings of the Xvie dynasty. In other places we found other papyri, among them the papyrus of the priestess Anhai in its original painted wooden case, which was in the form of the triune god of the resurrection, Ptah Seker Sar, and a leather roll containing the chapters of the Book of the Dead, with beautifully painted vignettes, and various other objects of the highest interest and importance. I took possession of all these papyri, etc., and we returned to Luxor at daybreak. Knowing ahead of time that he would be purchasing papyri that night, Budge had arranged for a tinsmith to construct cylindrical metal storage containers for him, and these were waiting for him when he returned from his trip to the tombs. The papyri were individually wrapped in cotton and placed in their tin containers, and the containers then tied up in linen cloths and placed in storage. When Budge left Luxor a few days later, he managed to smuggle out both the papyri and tablets, despite the strenuous efforts of the Egyptian officials to prevent him from doing so. When he reached Cairo, the precious papyri were repacked with waterproof cloth in place of the cotton, put in packing crates labeled as government property, and carried to Alexandria by a British military officer of Budge's acquaintance. The papyri were already in the possession of the British Museum in London before Budge left Cairo for Baghdad. Among the papyri which Budge acquired at Thebes was the one which was later found to contain the complete text of the Instruction of Amenemope, a hitherto unknown Egyptian wisdom text. Over the next half-century, Amenemope was to revolutionize the scholarly world's understanding of the interaction between ancient Egypt and biblical Israel. Unfortunately, Budge had no idea at the time just how important the scroll was, so his autobiography tells us nothing at all about the circumstances of its discovery. It makes its sole appearance in a terse item from a brief inventory of the second expedition's acquisitions. 3. A papyrus inscribed in hieratic, with a copy of the Admonitions of Amenemope, the son of Connect, on the obverse, and a complete calendar of lucky and unlucky days on the reverse, BC 1100, Brit Mus. No. 10,474. For a find which was later to garner worldwide attention, this sparse description is certainly unsatisfying and even a bit puzzling. Given Budge's effusive narration of some of his other discoveries, his reticence about providing similar details on Amenemope might lead one to wonder if perhaps he had something to hide. The more likely explanation, however, especially given his unabashed recounting of some of his other questionable exploits, is simply that his acquisition of Papyrus 10,474 was unremarkable at the time, that he made no contemporaneous record of the event, and that by the time he began to write about it more than 3 decades later, the details had long since slipped his mind. In any case, we know that the scroll was unrolled and examined almost immediately after it came into the hands of the British Museum, because a brief quotation was made from it by Renouf, the keeper of Assyrian and Egyptian antiquities, in a paper published in November of 1888. But Budge's attentions were elsewhere, primarily on his newly acquired manuscripts of the Book of the Dead, and publication of Amenemope was delayed for 3.5 decades. When it finally occurred, it took place in 3 different versions in 3 successive years, from 1922 to 1924. The first publication was an article entitled The Precepts of Life by Amenemope, the son of Connect, which appeared in a French centenary compendium. Here, Budge gave his first description of the manuscript itself, the Egyptian literary composition which I have called the Instruction of Life, i.e. the teaching which will instruct a man how to guide his actions with sense and discretion during his career, official or otherwise, is found written in the hieratic character on a papyrus in the British Museum, bearing the number 10,474. The papyrus is 12 feet 1/2 inch in length and 9 1/2 inches in breadth, and is mounted under glass in 7 sheets. The obverse is occupied by 28 columns of hieratic text. After describing in excruciating detail the exact line count in each column, which varies from 18 to 23, with the last column consisting only of the 1-line colophon, he goes on. The whole text, including the name of the scribe, contains 550 lines. The handwriting is comparatively small, and in places where the scribe crowded his words together is not very clear. But usually the characters are well-formed and easily legible, and to me they suggest that the papyrus was written under the XXIN dynasty, or a little later. On the reverse side is written in hieratic characters a copy of a calendar of lucky and unlucky days. It fills 12 columns of text, and each column, when completed, enumerated 30 days. The remainder of the article consisted of selected hieroglyphic transcriptions from the text of Amenemope, with accompanying translation and commentary. Since all of these were rendered obsolete by Budge's more careful publication of the same texts a year later, these need not concern us. More interesting, however, especially in light of subsequent developments, is the following comment from the end of the article. The extracts given above will indicate the importance of this book of maxims, which has much in common with the books of Sirach and Ecclesiasticus. It contains many shrewd, common-sense remarks and most excellent advice, which, though intended primarily for officials in the service of the government of ancient Egypt, might well be followed by officials and others in our own time. The resemblance of Amenemope to biblical wisdom literature, which Budge first noted here only in passing, was soon to become a cause célèbre that would forever transform the academic study of biblical wisdom literature. A year later, the British Museum issued Budge's formal publication of Papyrus 10,474 as part of its Facsimiles of Egyptian Hieratic Papyri series. This volume included, as the name implies, photographic facsimiles of the hieratic text of Amenemope, as well as a complete transliteration of the hieratic into hieroglyphics, a full translation, and a brief discussion of the manuscript's discovery, which we shall discuss shortly, and its significance. Also included was a short account of the texts on the verso side of the scroll, the calendar of lucky and unlucky days, to which Budge had already alluded, a hymn to Ra-Horak, a hymn to the moon god, and an instructional text of 49 lines in 3 columns. The latter, very badly written in a large coarse hand by an unskilled scribe, was also attributed to an Amenemope, but it was clearly not the work of the same author. In his introduction to the 1923 publication of Amenemope, Budge gave a considerably more detailed description of the physical characteristics of the scroll. When in a perfect condition, the papyrus was about 12th 1/2 in length, and its greatest width was 10 inches. The strips of papyrus used in making the roll are from 6 to 8 inches in width and are somewhat coarse in texture. Owing to the lack of care on the part of the scribe who gummed them together, the papyrus, when first unrolled, was fan-shaped. The upper margin was stretched, and the lower margin was contracted and broken away in several places, especially at the beginning of the roll. On the wa are 28 columns of text, including the colophon, which are written in small, clear, and usually well-formed hieratic characters. But in places where the scribe found it necessary to crowd his words, the characters are ill-formed and are not readily recognizable. The general characteristics of the handwriting seem to suggest that the papyrus was written under the XXist or XXED dynasty, or even a little later. The total number of lines on the obverse is 553, including the title and the colophon. The title and numbers of the sections or chapters are written in red budge. Noted in this edition, the similarity of Amenemope to earlier Egyptian wisdom texts, such the Instruction of Tahotep and the Instruction of Ani. But he also observed a significant difference. Amenemope was written to teach men morality and the fear of God, as much as to teach them worldly wisdom. This theme was to be taken up again and again by later commentators. Finally, in 1924, Budge published a more popular edition of Amenemope entitled The Teaching of Amenemope, the Son of Connect. This included a revised version of the hieroglyphic text and translation of Amenemope, which had already appeared in the facsimiles volume, along with English translations of a number of other Egyptian didactic texts, and an extensive commentary on Egyptian wisdom in general and Amenemope in particular. The only additional information this edition provided about the papyrus itself was a statement that when the scroll was found, the lower end was covered with clots of bitumen, which had to be removed, and that when the manuscript was first unrolled, in a few places, chiefly at the beginning of the text, the papyrus crumbled into dust. This explains the obvious damage to the early portions of the text, as well as the ragged appearance of the lower margin and the loss of an entire line from the bottom of column 2. It was also in this third publication of Amenemope that Budge first explicitly pointed out its similarity to the biblical book of Proverbs. The system of religious morality, which Amenemope reveals, is of a very high character, and in many particulars closely resembles that which has hitherto been regarded as almost exclusively the property of ancient Semitic and Sumerian peoples. Parallels to some of its precepts can be found in the Pentateuch, the Psalms, and the Proverbs of Solomon, and it is impossible not to wonder whether these at least are not due to some Asiatic influence which found its way into Egypt under the Middle Empire, or about the time of the rule of the Hyksos over Lower Egypt. Whether this be so or not, I cannot believe that they are of African or native Egyptian origin. As we shall see, Budge's intuition that Amenemope was related to the Book of Proverbs was right on the mark, but he got the direction in which the influences had traveled exactly backward. He was certainly not the last person to make that mistake.
Where did Papyrus 10,474 really come from?
Budge's contribution to British Egyptology can only be described as immense. He was personally responsible for acquiring and making accessible to the public vast quantities of priceless Egyptian artifacts which would otherwise have been destroyed or locked up in private collections, and his literary output of more than 120 major publications is by far the largest and most diverse of any Orientalist, past or present. In the particular case of the Instruction of Amenemope, Budge's contribution is simply incalculable, since it was he who discovered and published the only complete text of it ever found. Without him, all we would possess is scattered fragments. On the other hand, Budge has also been accused of shady dealings in his acquisition of foreign antiquities for the British Museum, and of sloppy scholarship in his many publications. The former allegations, though they certainly affected his reputation both past and present, are of questionable veracity. What some consider illicit methods of operation, others have described more charitably as great success in dealing with the natives and in overcoming official obstruction. But the charge of sloppy scholarship is undeniable. the same biographer who forgave Budge's wheeling and dealing in the antiquities trade, also declared that, in hieroglyphic scholarship, his standard was not a high one, for he refused to keep abreast of modern philological development and obstinately adhered to obsolete methods. By his rapidity of working, many mistakes and inaccuracies occur in his published texts, and as a former co-worker and longtime friend explained in Budge's obituary in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, the truth must be told that he suffered all his life from a desire to get things done. He was in too great a hurry to finish. Definite in all his ways, he grudged the time spent in rounding off the corners, and this impatience was frequently to stand in his way, but on the other hand, he got things done royally. In retrospect, it is no surprise that Budge chose to work in this fashion, for it was none other than William Wright, the young Budge's tutor and mentor, who had impressed upon him that a bad translation was better than none at all, because it would at least afford material for someone to make a better one. And indeed, Budge's quick and 30 publication of his own discoveries with the full expectation that others would later improve upon them shows a generosity of spirit that stands in marked contrast with the sorry history of publication, or the lack thereof, in a number of other areas. As his obituary writer observed, my criticism about his work is intended as a light one, for although it undeniably does show this haste, his energy was indefatigable in putting before the Oriental world texts, and again texts. One of those texts, of course, was the Instruction of Amenemope, and Budge's discovery and publication of it has put us forever in his debt. Unfortunately, as we shall see, his scholarly lapses have also sometimes made the task of deciphering that text considerably more difficult. The first place where Budge's less than optimal scholarship hinders our understanding of Amenemope is with respect to the provenance of Papyrus 10,474. Which is our primary witness to the text. It is crucial to ascertain the date when a particular witness to the text was copied, and sometimes also the place where it was copied, since that tells us the proper interpretive framework to use in reading and analyzing it. This is especially true for works from ancient Egypt, since, as we saw in a previous chapter, the chronological range within which a particular copy could conceivably be placed is immense, spanning in some cases 2.5 millennia, while the vocabulary, grammar, and handwriting employed by the scribes varied considerably depending on both time and location. But as we have seen, Budge's autobiography provided none of the details of Papyrus 10,474's acquisition, which might be used to assign a date to it, nor did it tell us much about where the manuscript was found. Nor can this lack be made up from any of Budge's other writings, all of which, when it comes to the finding of this particular papyrus, are extremely terse. His longest statement on the subject came in the introduction to his 1923 facsimile publication of the papyrus. Here he declared that it was found in the same tomb with two other scrolls, one made of papyrus 10,471 and one of vellum 10,473, which it was subsequently determined together comprised a single copy of the so-called Book of the Dead. He continued, "The owner of all three documents seems to have been one Necht, a military scribe, and they were all found together in a broken box in a tomb in western Thebes. Papyrus 10,474 was found inside a painted wooden figure of Osiris, into which it had been introduced through a hole in the lower end. Many funerary papyri have been found thrust up inside wooden figures of Osiris, e.g. the Papyrus of Hunefer and Papyrus of Enhai, but literary papyri have usually been found in coffins or in small coffers and boxes. But just how trustworthy is this information? The answer seems to be not very. Our first consideration must be the question of Budge's own reliability on such matters. Unfortunately, he does not fare well on this score. It appears that he did not, or at least not always, keep contemporaneous records of his acquisitions, but rather reconstructed circumstances from memory, months or even years later, with the assistance of informal records such as personal letters. Consequently, as T.G.H. James, Mark Smith, and others have conclusively demonstrated in a number of instances, there is substantial reason to suspect the accuracy of Budge's statements about the timing and location of particular acquisitions, and in some cases his descriptions are demonstrably false. In his analysis of Budge's accounts concerning the mysterious underground chapel or chamber in the vicinity of the Temple of Karnak, James was able to show that the objects identified there as having been among its contents were unlikely ever to have been found together as parts of a single assemblage. These included one item which had already been in the British Museum for 6 years prior to the supposed discovery. In light of what has been said, it should be clear that we cannot accept Budge's accounts uncritically. We should be wary of any statement of his concerning the place or the circumstances in which these objects were found in the absence of any corroborating evidence. Hence, we must view Budge's account of the discovery of Papyrus 10,474 with a certain skepticism. And indeed, close examination shows that skepticism to be justified. First, we should note Budge's carefully qualified language. He says that the owner of all 3 documents seems to have been Nacht, which suggests that even in his own mind there was some reason for doubt. As a matter of fact, both funerary scrolls explicitly bear Nacht's name, so there is no doubt whatever on that score. But there is nothing in Papyrus 10,474 to suggest that anyone named Nacht ever had anything to do with it. Note also that Budge does not state that he found the 3 papyri together, but only that they were found together by a person or persons unnamed. This strongly suggests that Budge was not relating facts based on his own observation, but rather the assertions of the local dealer or tomb robber from whom he acquired the items. Assertions which cannot be verified, and which by their very nature must be taken with considerable reserve. Even more suggestive is the fact that Papyrus 10,474 was said to have been found inside a painted wooden figure of Osiris. Such figures are a well-known feature of New Kingdom burials, and are sufficiently numerous that a detailed taxonomy of them has been established. One of the things this taxonomy demonstrates, however, is that, as Budge himself recognized, the only papyri commonly found in such figures are funerary in nature, copies of the Book of the Dead, the Book of What is in the Underworld, etc. If indeed Papyrus 10,474, which is a literary text rather than a funerary one, was found inside an Osiris figure, this would seem to be the only recorded instance of its kind. Point 5. Our suspicions on this point are further strengthened by the fact that the Osiris figure in which Papyrus 10,474 was allegedly found seems to have disappeared from the record. In the footnotes to the paragraph quoted above, Budge gives further details on the Osiris figures in which the Hunnefer and Anhai papyri were found, including their British Museum inventory numbers, 9861 and 20,868 respectively. But oddly enough, he gives no inventory number for the Osiris figure associated with Papyrus 10,474, which suggests that this particular figure was not acquired by Budge along with the papyrus. And finally, there is the question of where all 3 documents were said to have been found: in a broken box in a tomb in western Thebes. Even assuming that this is actually where Budge's informant discovered the 3 scrolls, it almost certainly cannot have been the original resting place of all 3. It is true that copies of the Book of the Dead are sometimes found in oblong storage boxes, although such scrolls were far more commonly placed in the coffin with the mummy. And it is even possible that the broken box, which Budge described, was the original storage container of the 2 Nacht scrolls. But Osiris figures are never found packed away like other grave goods. They were invariably placed either immediately adjacent to the coffin or within it. In undisturbed burials, the presence of only 1 statue per buried individual can be ascertained. This has been placed in the sarcophagus chamber close to the mummy, outside the outer coffin at the head or the feet or alongside the shoulder, pelvis, or ankle, inside the outer coffin at the head, standing up or lying down on the breast of the inner coffin. We may conclude that a very direct relation between statue and corpse was thought to exist. Obviously, the statue had to play some part in the transition from death to afterlife. This magical transition would obviously have been made more difficult, perhaps fatally so from the Egyptian perspective, if the Osiris figure were not in close and convenient proximity to the mummy, but rather packed away in a box somewhere. The reanimated deceased might well have been thought able to rummage around in his tomb for a copy of the Book of the Dead to equip him for his journey to the West. But it might be quite another thing if the magic required to reanimate him in the first place were not near at hand when it was needed. What all this suggests is that Budge's informant, assuming any veracity in his account at all, was not describing the in situ contents of Nocht's tomb, but rather the contents of a tomb robber's cache that had been squirreled away for safekeeping, perhaps even in ancient times, and subsequently recovered by someone else. By its very nature, such a cache could easily have contained items from several different locales and several different dates. The manuscript of Amenemope, therefore, may not originally have been located inside in the Osiris figure at all, much less in the tomb where it and the other objects were found. And neither the Osiris figure nor Papyrus 10,474 need necessarily have had any connection whatever to the Nocht of the two funerary scrolls. It follows that if we are going to use the Nocht scrolls to help us determine the provenance of the Amenemope scroll, or not, as the case may be, we cannot simply rely on Budge's claim that all three were found together. Only when we have independently arrived at a date for each of the three scrolls can we know whether there is any genuine relationship between Nocht and our text of the instruction.
Dating Papyrus 10,474.
Fortunately, the two Nocht scrolls can easily be dated on artistic and paleographic grounds to the end of the 18th dynasty and beginning of the 19th, and there are historical arguments which plausibly locate them almost precisely at the transition between I and Horemheb-Ka, 1321 BC. For details, see Appendix 3 Amenemope, papyrus itself. As we have already seen, Budge's initial guess for the date of Papyrus 10,474, as reported to the British Museum in the inventory of his 1887-1888 expedition, was 1100 BC, which would have placed it toward the end of the 20th dynasty. In a photographic plate accompanying his 1920 autobiography, he opened the range a bit to somewhere between the 20th and the 22nd. In his first, partial publication of the text in 1922, he opted for the latter, end of that range, stating that to his eye the character suggests that the papyrus was written under the XXIN dynasty, or a little later, which would place it somewhere between the years 945 and 700 AD. A year later, he changed this to the XXist or XXInd dynasty, or even a little later. A year after that, he wrote that the general style of the writing suggests that this copy of Amenemope's teaching was made under the Text or XXInt dynasty. Apparently, he was having trouble making up his mind, but despite all the gyrating around, it is clear that Budge consistently wished to place Papyrus 10,474 no later than the 8th century BC. Spiegelberg, in a review of Budge's 1923 volume, agreed with the latter's initial dating of Papyrus 10,474 to the 22nd dynasty. 58 Ehrman agreed that it was no older than that, but thought it was quite likely to be substantially younger and could possibly be as late as the 6th century BC. But it was Lange who first systematically spelled out the case for a late dating based on the following peculiarities, among others, of the papyrus's orthography. Explicit versification of the text, with only one verse line per manuscript line, confusion of voiced and unvoiced consonants, D with T, Q with G, spelling of the preposition ER and the preposition R, addition of syllabic endings, such as I, we, and tai, which are superfluous from the standpoint of the classical language, frequent omission of the prepositions M, N, and R, indiscriminate interchange of the prepositions M and N, spelling of the P, I, T, AI, and NA possessive series with an intrusive W, P, AY, PHI, PAY, explicit vocalization of suffixes attached to feminine nouns and infinitives, e.g. the classical languages AXTF, his property, becomes AXW, addition of a superfluous T1 in negative imperatives, frequent use of double and even triple prepositions, e.g. RM, AMA, where the classical language expects single ones. To this list, one might also add writing of an apparently superfluous W at the end of singular nouns. Conversion of R to I when it ends a word or syllable, often indicated by the addition of a reed after the. Thus, what looks like PTRI is actually pronounced PTEI. Its loss of terminal T, especially when it represents an unsixed feminine ending, and terminal N, especially in demonstrative adjectives. Occasional replacement of X by S. frequent replacement of T by T and D by D, writing of MD as MX, prefixing a so-called prothetic yod or helping vowel before certain verb forms. Perhaps most conspicuously, the spelling of many words, both foreign borrowings and native Egyptian, in syllabic orthography, wherein both vowels and consonants are represented. E, Yud, Abdi, Rod, cognate with Hebrew plus B, or the spelling of D, Tai, the classical language's word for the metal lead, as D, Ati. On the basis of such orthographic features, all of which are symptomatic of the later stages of the language, Lang declared that the papyrus could be no earlier than the beginning of the Persian era, i.e. after 525 BC. He even suggested, on the basis of alleged similarities to the papyrus of Nesmin, that one would not be far off to situate papyrus 10,474 in the Ptolemaic era, after the Alexandrian conquest of 332 BC. Griffith, however, rejected Lang's extremely late dating on the basis of unpublished manuscripts, which showed that Lang's allegedly Ptolemaic orthography was nothing of the kind, but could be found as early as the 25th dynasty reign of Taharqa, 690 to 664. Griffith himself initially suggested that papyrus 10,474 should be situated in the 26th dynasty, 664 to 525-67, but he later modified this to a date somewhere between the 25th dynasty and the reign of Darius, which would put it between the years 747 and 486 BC. See, Moeller, one of the early 20th century's foremost experts on Egyptian paleography, gave the papyrus an even later date than Griffith, although not as late as Lang, assigning it to the 27th dynasty, 525, page 404, point 7 Albright. Writing in the 1950s assigned it more generally to the Bubastite or Site period, between the 10th and the 6th centuries BC. Posner, writing in the 1960s, placed it at the transition between the 26th and 27th dynasties. A decade later, Williams came to a similar conclusion, declaring that we can now assign it more precisely to the 26th or 27th dynasty, i.e. to the 6th century BC. There, the issue appears finally to have come to rest. Whatever the exact date of papyrus 10,474, one thing seems clear. It cannot be contemporaneous with the two Nacht funerary scrolls with which it was allegedly found. The latter can be no later than the early 19th dynasty, while papyrus 10,474 can be no earlier than the 22nd, and most likely is as late as the 26th or 27th. A gap of at least 3.5 centuries, and perhaps as much as 8.5. We are forced, therefore, to conclude that wherever and whenever our primary text of Amenemope originated, it did not come from the tomb or the time of Nacht, and hence, the Nacht manuscripts are of no use to us whatever. Fortunately, they are not crucial. There is plenty of other evidence for us to draw on.
Dating the original composition, the first phase.
Even more important than dating the witnesses to the text is determining the date of the text's original composition, since this inevitably influenced the author's cultural preconceptions and largely determined the vocabulary and linguistic structures which were available to him. In determining the date of composition, there are two basic approaches, which we may term literary and linguistic. The former analyzes the style and content of the text and locates these in an appropriate Sitz in Leben, or situation in life. The latter, on the other hand, looks for clues in the author's employment of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, all of which can be dated to a particular era by the documented changes in usage which the language has undergone over time. The linguistic approach gives the appearance of being the more scientific, since it can more easily tie its conclusions to the hard evidence unearthed by archaeologists, monumental inscriptions, the architecture of temples and tombs, and precisely dated changes in the styles of pottery, writing tablets, papyrus production, and so forth. Our text uses word X, which makes its first appearance in the inscriptions of the Ptolemaic era. Therefore, our text could not have been composed before the year 332 BC. Case closed. Unfortunately, matters are seldom this simple, especially in ancient Egypt, where literary works are known to have been copied and recopied for literally thousands of years. As we noted in the previous chapter, there is always a tendency for alterations, both accidental and deliberate, to creep into a text when it is copied repeatedly over a long period of time. In addition to the inevitable errors of omission and confusion, scribes will sometimes consciously update the vocabulary and grammar of the text they are copying to bring it into line with current usage. On the other hand, deliberate use of archaic vocabulary and grammar was also widely practiced by Egyptian authors, who were either conforming to the rules of decorum or else trying to give their compositions a false aura of antiquity. In either case, the resulting copies of a text can easily reflect the usages of an era much different from that of the text's original composition, which, if taken in isolation, could mislead the analyst into thinking that the composition took place centuries earlier or later than it actually did. For these and other reasons, the dates assigned to the various copies of a text cannot by themselves establish the date of the author's original composition. At best, they can establish a terminus ante quem, or date before which the original composition must have taken place. It is crucial, therefore, to distinguish carefully between the evidence for the date of a text's original composition and the evidence for the dates of the various surviving witnesses to that text. This applies not only to the analysis of the text's paleography, the style of the handwriting and orthography, the way individual words are spelled, but also when dealing with vocabulary and even grammar. A number of early commentators on the Instruction of Amenemope seem to have lost sight of this basic principle, but even for those who did manage to keep it in view, the task of determining the date of Amenemope's original composition proved to be extraordinarily difficult. In fact, from the acquisition of Papyrus 10,474 by Budge in 1888 until well past the middle of the 20th century, the dates suggested for the composition of Amenemope varied wildly, from the 18th dynasty to the Ptolemaic era. An intolerably broad range, but one which it seemed impossible to narrow definitively. Budge himself had originally proposed that Amenemope was composed during the first half of the 18th dynasty, well before the rise of the Amarna heresy. When Amenemope apt lived and under which king he flourished cannot be said, but it seems highly probable that he was born during the reign of one of the kings of the Xviith dynasty. The fact that the name of Amen, the king of the gods, forms part of our author's name suggests that the cult of this god was predominant when he was born. But it is quite clear that he was no follower of Amen and no admirer of his cult, for, except as a component part of his name, Amen is neither mentioned nor referred to in the teaching. On the other hand, it is pretty clear that when Amenemope composed his teaching, Amen had not reached the exalted position of king of the gods, which he attained as the result of the conquests of Thutmose III in the Sudan and Western Asia. I would therefore assign the teaching to the first half of the period of the Kenves dynasty, probably soon after Amenhotep I had rebuilt the Temple of Amen in the northern Apec, and established and endowed the priesthood of Amen.